She was only 17 years old, a high school senior with a kind heart, bright mind, and an entire future waiting to unfold. Her name was Shondra May, and in the winter of 1986, she was living in the small Mississippi town of Forest, finishing her last months of school at Leake Academy and working evenings at the local McDonald's to help support her family. Friends remembered her as dependable, respectful, and thoughtful, while her teachers praised her discipline and determination. She lived with her mother Janelle and her adoptive brother Tim. Her father Richard, a riverboat pilot, was often away for work up and down the Mississippi River, which meant that her mother carried much of the responsibility of raising the children. Despite the challenges, Shandra was a steady presence in the household. She balanced school, part-time work, and family obligations, embodying the role of a daughter who never wanted to cause worry. By the beginning of February, she was eagerly anticipating graduation. Life in a small town can be predictable, but for Shandra, the routine offered comfort. No one could have imagined that within days, the town would be gripped by one of the darkest and most haunting crimes in Mississippi's history. On the evening of February 4, 1986, Shandra attended her regular classes at Leake Academy before heading into Forest for her evening shift at McDonald's. She clocked in around 6 o'clock. That night was bitterly cold and rainy, a damp southern winter evening that kept many customers at home. Business was unusually slow, so at 7:24 p.m., Shandra clocked out early. Before leaving, she made a brief phone call to her mother Janelle, reassuring her that she was on her way home. Driving her 1985 Isuzu, she made 2 short stops along the way, one at a TGNY store and another at a small variety shop, where she purchased a Valentine's Day card, likely for her boyfriend Tony Adams. Witnesses recalled seeing her at the store that evening, cheerful as ever, unaware that she was living the last hours of her life. Around 7:40 p.m., she was last seen leaving Forest. When she did not arrive home, Janelle became anxious. This was not like her daughter. By late evening, her worry had grown into panic. Richard, away for work, phoned home and advised Janelle to get in touch with relatives to search along the route. Shortly afterward, Shandra's car was discovered parked less than 100 meters from the family's home. The driver's side door was ajar. Inside were her purse and personal belongings, but her driver's license was missing. The placement of the car was chilling, so close to the safety of home, yet abandoned. There were no signs of forced entry or visible struggle. Crucial mistakes were made almost immediately. The car was not secured as a crime scene, and family members moved it before investigators could properly examine it. Tire tracks, footprints, and fingerprints that might have offered early answers were lost forever. For Janelle and the rest of the family, the sight of the car was devastating. Shandra had been so close to home, yet she had vanished without a trace. News of her disappearance spread quickly across Scott County. Posters with her smiling face appeared in shop windows and on bulletin boards. Volunteers scoured rural roads and wooded areas, hoping for any sign of the missing teenager. As days turned into weeks, the sense of dread deepened. Every passing hour, without answers, weighed heavily on the community. 22 days after she disappeared, their worst fears were realized. On the morning of February 26, 1986, off-duty firefighters on a hunting trip near Baker Creek in Bolton, some 80 miles from Forest, noticed black plastic bags caught in the water. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary debris. But as the men pulled the bags to shore, they uncovered a horrifying discovery. Inside were the remains of Shondra May. The condition of her body revealed the cruelty she had endured. She had been bound and gagged with packing tape, the kind often used in poultry plants common in the region. Her body was wrapped in garbage bags, deliberately concealed, and then dumped in the creek, showing signs of severe assault. Forensic evidence suggested she had been restrained and possibly suffocated before her body was discarded, confirming the cause of death. The timeline suggested she may have been kept alive for up to 2 weeks after her abduction before she was killed. The water and passage of time complicated the autopsy, eroding critical evidence and raising speculation that she might have been kept elsewhere before being discarded in the creek. The brutality was staggering. Shandra's 18th birthday had passed just days earlier, while she was still missing. And now the community learned that her life had been ended in one of the most disturbing homicides Mississippi had ever seen. The sheriff at the time described it as a crime that would haunt the county for decades. In the wake of the discovery, investigators turned first to those closest to Shandra. Her father Richard was questioned, as was her boyfriend Tony Adams. Both men were eventually cleared. Another lead involved a man in Meridian known for impersonating police officers, raising the possibility that Shandra had trusted someone posing as law enforcement. That theory was plausible, since her car showed no signs of forced entry or struggle, suggesting she may have willingly stopped. But no evidence linked the impersonator to her murder. By the early 1990s, suspicion began to fall on a local man named Rubin Weeks. Weeks had a history of violence and spent time in jail for forgery during 1987 and 1988. He was interrogated about Shandra's murder in 1992 while incarcerated in Missouri, but again, there was no physical evidence to tie him to the crime. The investigation was crippled by earlier errors, the failure to preserve her car as a crime scene, and the absence of usable DNA evidence. Journalists revisited her case periodically, often comparing it to other murders in Mississippi that bore disturbing similarities. The 1987 disappearance of Shandra May, the 1993 murder of Lori Hill, and other unsolved cases all shared patterns of restraint and disposal. Some suspected that a serial offender could be responsible for multiple crimes, but without concrete evidence, no direct connections were ever proven. As the years passed, rumors multiplied, false leads consumed investigators' time, and every anniversary brought pain for Shandra's family. Her case became one of the state's coldest and most notorious unsolved murders, a grim reminder of how quickly evidence can be lost and justice delayed. By the 2000s, Shandra's case remained a haunting mystery. Advances in DNA technology brought hope, but by the time forensic tools matured, much of the evidence had degraded. Families of other victims pressed for answers, and journalists highlighted systemic failures in evidence handling during the 1980s. Shandra's case stood as a symbol of both tragedy and institutional shortcomings. For her mother Janelle, the decades were filled with unanswered questions and the unrelenting grief of losing a child without justice. The town of Forest never forgot her, but over time, many feared her killer would never be held accountable. That fear began to change in April 2025, almost 40 years after the crime. Investigators reopened the case with modern forensic tools and a new commitment to finding the truth. Advances in interviewing techniques and community outreach encouraged people who had remained silent for decades to finally speak. Witnesses who had lived in fear during the 1980s now came forward, recounting suspicious behavior by Rubin Weeks around the time of Shandra's disappearance. Their testimony, when combined with the preserved autopsy findings, the method of disposal, and the timeline of her death, created a compelling narrative that prosecutors could finally present in court. Weeks, now 63 years old, was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. Authorities emphasized that the case was built not on a single revelation, but on the cumulative strength of evidence gathered across nearly 4 decades. For Shandra's family, the arrest brought both relief and sorrow. Relief that someone would finally be held accountable. Sorrow that it had taken nearly 40 years for justice to arrive. Investigators pointed to the case as proof that cold cases must never be abandoned. Time may silence some voices, but it also frees others. Forensic science continues to advance, offering tools that detectives in 1986 could not have imagined. The arrest of Rubin Weeks symbolized not only accountability, but also the resilience of Shandra's memory. The courtroom proceedings brought Shandra's story into focus once again. Prosecutors laid out the case, the evidence of restraint, the disposal in garbage bags, the testimony of witnesses who described Weeks' suspicious behavior, and the brutality of the crime itself. Weeks, who had lived freely for decades, was now facing the full weight of justice. The charges reflected the severity of what he had done: kidnapping and murder of a 17-year-old girl whose life had barely begun. For the family, attending hearings was an act of courage, a reminder of the daughter and sister they had lost. For the community, it was a reckoning with a crime that had cast a shadow for nearly half a century. Shandra May's story carries lasting lessons. It highlights the devastating consequences of mishandled evidence. Had her car been treated as a crime scene from the beginning, crucial details might have been preserved. It demonstrates the limitations of 1980s forensic science, when DNA testing was still in its infancy and often unavailable to small towns. And it underscores the importance of persistence. Cases must remain open, files must be preserved, and communities must be reminded that justice, though delayed, can still be achieved. Shandra's life was cut tragically short, but her memory endures. She is remembered not only as a victim, but also as a symbol of resilience, a teenager whose story shaped how investigators approach cold cases today. For her family, the pain will never fully disappear. But the arrest and prosecution of her killer ensure that her voice, silenced in 1986, was finally heard in 2025. Shandra May's case stands as one of Mississippi's most haunting tragedies and one of its most powerful examples of justice delayed but not denied. It is a reminder that even after decades, truth can rise to the surface. Her community continues to honor her memory, knowing that her story has changed the way cold cases are pursued. For Shandra's mother, the resolution may never erase the loss, but it affirms that her daughter's life mattered and that her memory will never be forgotten.